Okay, so let's take a look at an article here by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who you're probably aware of. He's a well-known author, and he was involved to some degree with Trump's administration over the last few years as well. Now, he in the last year to year and a half, surprisingly, he became a bit of a conservative, certainly in relation to the Rona. Um, he took a very kind of conformist line with regards to the Rona, and that was disappointing for a guy who's clearly so intelligent, for a guy who's got some incredible ideas and written some amazing books. That was very disappointing. But we still have some incredible articles and books that he's written over the last number of years, and this is one article that I highly recommend you have a read through in your own time. Now it's a long article; it'll take you quite a while to get through it and to ingest everything that's in the article. But there's so many lessons in here, and what actually reminded me of this article was when I saw the response to the LGBT, the sort of hardline LGBT supporters protesting against the church in Ballyfermot, and that was an example of the most intolerant wins. And you'll find this with the likes of, and it's not everyone, of course, but we'll say the more prominent activist types within the whole LGBT movement, the more prominent types within all of the black power, black supremacy, black racial supremacy, BLM types as well. Um, the same thing with some of the more prominent Muslim speakers and prominent Jewish speakers, and some of the trans people are incredibly narcissistic and just extremely intolerant. But all it takes is a small amount of extremely intolerant people, intolerant of others that don't completely align with their worldview. All it takes is a small bunch of those people to, to sort of impact on the majority and to force their ways on the majority. And there's some great examples of this within this article here, which Taleb wrote. And this comes from Skin in the Game. And one good example here is how Europe will eat halal. Now, what that means is, you know, there's a lot of meat today, even in Ireland, in Ireland and Britain and Europe generally, and around the world, in Western countries, where even in countries where the Muslim population is small, you'll still find a lot of the food products are halal, and a lot of them are kosher as well. And there's a reason for that, and I'll come to it down in the article here. But let's just have a read here. So the best example I know that gives insights into the functioning of a complex system is with the following situation. It suffices for an intransigent minority, a certain type of intransigent minority, to reach a minutely small level, say 3 to 4% of the total population, for the entire population to have to submit to their preferences. And this is a really important point. And you can see that in Ireland, the wishes of the LGBT activist types, the wishes of that community get inflicted on the rest of society, even though they're only, 3% or something like that. Similarly with Islam, they also have these groups and trans people as well, who are only a small percentage of the overall population, but they have an outsized influence on everyone else. And it's partly, well, it's a lot of it is because they're intolerant. A lot of it is because they're intransigent. And wider society sees that. They see that these groups are very intolerant of others that don't agree with them. And as a result, they submit to them. Whilst you take the average person, the average straight Irish person, um, or even someone who's, say Catholic or one of the Christian religions, um, you know, we're generally tolerant people. We're tolerant of other views, of other worldviews. That's not so much with all of the LGBT stuff. It's certainly with the trans stuff. It's not even with the gay stuff either. Um, Islam and Judaism are also tend to be quite intolerant of people who don't go along with their with their wishes, And that is the whole point again. The intolerant minority have this outsized influence on the tolerant majority. Let's have a look down through the article here, see can we find examples of this. Yeah, so the minority rule will show us all how all it takes is a small number of intolerant, virtuous people with skin in the game, for society to function properly. Okay. Yeah, so if you look at food or drinks, you'll sometimes see these small little symbols on them, like a U in a circle. Where's it gone? Yeah. So the lemonade container with the circled U indicating it is literally kosher, And there's a symbol for halal as well. I've forgotten what it is, but you will, if you look at food and drinks packaging, you will start to see these symbols. And it's subtle, but it's there. But it's a way of saying the food is either kosher or halal. And you'd be amazed at how much food is kosher or halal. But we're not asked if that's what we want. The food producers just make it that way, because the thing is, the average person will eat food or will drink liquids that are halal or kosher, partly because they don't even realize it's halal or kosher, but because it includes Muslims and Jews. It includes them as well as everyone else. Whilst if you have food that is not halal or is not kosher, then partly those groups will kick up a fuss about it, but it's also because you're including more of the population. You have a bigger target audience. You have a bigger consumer base if you make food that is halal and kosher compliant, and drinks as well that are halal and kosher compliant, rather than having food and drink which is not halal and kosher compliant. So it's easier for the food producers to just make the food that way, to go along with that, and it gives them a bigger consumer base, so bigger products or bigger profits rather. So it's win-win, if you like, for the food manufacturers, for the drinks manufacturers. So this kind of summarizes it here. A kosher or halal eater will never eat non-kosher or non-halal food, but a non-kosher eater isn't banned from eating kosher, you see? So that's how it works, And, food and drinks manufacturers are smart. They know this, They know that the bottom line is, profits-wise, there's more potential to make profits from including, from basically making their food and drinks halal and kosher compliant. Let's go on a little bit here. Okay, like I said, it's a long article, so but I just want to focus in on a few parts in here. Okay, now consider this manifestation of the dictatorship of the minority. In the United Kingdom, where the practicing Muslim population is only 3 to 4%, and this is 2016, so it's obviously increased since then. But a very high number of the meat we find is halal. Close to 70% of lamb imports from New Zealand are halal, even though I think the Muslim population in New Zealand is not that high, Again, I don't know exactly, but I'd imagine it's no more than maybe 2% or so, 2.5%. I'd say it's not much more than that anyway. And yet close to 70% of lamb imports from that country are halal. Close to 10% of the chain Subway carry halal only stores, meaning no pork, in spite of the high costs from the loss of business of non-pork stores. The same holds in South Africa, where with the same proportion of Muslims, a disproportionately high number of chicken is halal certified. Okay, but in the UK and other Christian countries, halal is not neutral enough to reach a high level, as people may rebel against forceful obedience to others' religious norms. But that's changing, That is changing, and halal is becoming more prevalent now as the Muslim population increases. One can expect the same rejection of religious norms to take place in the West as the Muslim population in Europe grows. Okay, let's continue on a little bit further on now. Okay, an important point here. So the minority rule may produce a larger share of halal food in the stores than warranted by the proportion of halal eaters in the population. This is the pattern we're seeing across all of the West. We're seeing it in Germany, in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Britain, and it's starting to creep into Ireland now as well, of course, as we have a small but quite fast growing Muslim population. Um, yeah, okay, so let's continue on a bit now. Right, okay, makes an example here as well of the fact that at least in America you have a lot of automatic cars, and the thinking behind that is because people who can drive manual shift like standard gear shift cars, we can quite easily transfer over to automatic. But the other way around is not necessarily true, It's easier for us to transfer to an automatic car rather than vice versa. Like a person who's learned how to drive automatics might not be able to drive a manual gear shift car. Um, okay. There's another there's another particular paragraph which I wanted to find. That's an interesting point there, which I just missed out on. Um, you would think that because some extreme right or left wing party has, say, the support of 10% of the population, that their candidate would get 10% of the votes. But that's generally not the case because, again, it comes down to the inflexibility, the intolerance factor. And you can often find that because these people are extremely, intransigent in their views, they can get an outsized influence on people. And that can result in a much higher percentage of the population going along with them rather than their actual numbers would warrant. Um, yeah, then he makes a point about McDonald's, and McDonald's appears to be a safe bet. And I think part of that is because McDonald's, as far as I know, in a lot of countries have halal and kosher food, so it's a safe bet. So it's a safe bet for not just the standard population, but also for Jews and Muslims because they know to be catered for there. So again, McDonald's going by the profit principle. They've got a higher consumer base if they just go along with halal and kosher compliant rules, and it's one of the reasons why you see McDonald's everywhere. Um, okay, there's one final point I wanted to cover: lingua franca. Okay, and this is an interesting one. And Ireland is a case in point of this because English is such a global language, and it's everywhere. And because it's such a global language, because it's such an influential language everywhere, it's in all facets of society. It's not only in politics and institutional level, it's in culture, it's in music, it's in film, it's in the arts, and you have the situation where if you're meeting with a bunch of Europeans, the chances of them all speaking French or all speaking German are probably slim enough, but the chances of them all knowing some English is quite high. So if you're going to have a meeting with a bunch of people from different European countries, it's more likely that you're going to use English as the common language, which everyone is able to understand some of, rather than having the meeting in French or German, where maybe only half of the people have French or have German. So because of that, because of that factor, English is going to have more influence. English is going to spread more readily. And with the result that sort of native languages, smaller languages, are going to struggle against English. And we've seen that in Ireland where, English has become the dominant language over the centuries. And it's had that, what would you call it, that sort of corrosive effect on Irish. And a similar thing, interestingly, I've travelled into a lot of continental Europe as well, and you have a similar factor going on with German in Central Europe as well. And you find that as Germans move into Switzerland, for instance, there was a rule, I think it was about 2004 or so, which allowed Germans and Poles and other EU people to come into Switzerland, and it was sometime around 2004, I think. And so basically, Germans particularly, but also other nationalities from parts of the EU, started coming into EU, started coming to Switzerland, sorry, in greater numbers. And what started to happen was German, or High German as they call it, Hochdeutsch, began to become much more prevalent in Switzerland, you know. And it was partly because of the amount of Germans coming in, but it was also because people from other parts of Europe were more likely to be able to speak some German, were more likely to know some German, some Hochdeutsch, than they were to know the local language, Swiss German. And so that helped to reinforce German as the standard language, even in Switzerland in many places, rather than Schweizerdeutsch, the Swiss German, you know? So with the result that there's this, again, this kind of undermining effect of the local language, Swiss German, by the more culturally dominant language of Standard German, you know. And this has worked its way into the language. You see this as well in train stations and even in education and so on, in culture within Switzerland. You see people will switch to German quickly. If they're interviewed for television, they will very quickly speak in standard German rather than their own language of Swiss German. And it's because they know most people watching will be able to speak standard German, but they might necessarily be able to speak Swiss German. And especially for foreigners, like foreigners in Switzerland, a lot of them will have some German, but really only the native Swiss will have Swiss German. So it's a kind of politeness thing as well, you know, that for the Swiss to actually switch into standard German so that everyone understands, rather than sticking just in Swiss German, which pretty much only the native Swiss understand. But the result being that German becomes more and more dominant, and it starts to kind of gradually take over at an institutional level, at educational level, at cultural level. And as a result, you have this kind of gradual undermining effect of the local language. And of course, the local language, in the same way that Irish is such an important language within Ireland, as a connection to our culture, to our history, to our heritage, to our land, even, you know, to our religion to an extent as well. It's the same with Swiss German in Switzerland. You look at the language, and it's constructed in such a way that it is tied to the land. It is tied to Switzerland itself, to its cultures, to its customs, to its history. So if you start to undermine that by allowing an outside language to come in and start dominating, you are in a sense undermining yourself culturally. You will gradually undermine your own the Swiss cultural fabric, in the same way that Ireland's cultural fabric is somewhat eroded by being so suppliant, so sort of submissive in a sense to the dominant cultural language of English. You know, so this is why really native languages like Swiss German, and Austrian German, I guess as well, and Irish, languages like this. We need to hold on to these languages. We need to speak them, and we need to make sure that the dominant cultural languages of English and German are not allowed, to have that undermining, corrosive effect on our own languages. Okay, that were always there before these other foreign languages came in, and that they don't have that effect of that they're not allowed to dominate and therefore undermine our own culture, not just our language, but our actual culture, our fabric, our cultural fabric itself is threatened by the dominance of these big, massive, global languages like English and German. So it's important not to allow that to happen, and by insisting that we hold on to our own languages and we try and keep them strong in the face of these, really dominant global languages like English and German. So yeah, so I went on quite a long time with that last point, but it is an important one, and it's why we should always resist, the likes of these green politicians, for instance, some of them who don't give a damn about Irish. They don't give a damn about Irish. They'd have Irish thrown out of school, and it's because they don't care about the culture of this country. They don't care about the history of this country. They don't care about the legacy, the ancestral legacy of Irish people, of what we went through, our struggles. You know how much it took us Centuries it took us to shake off the yoke of British imperialism, and now they want to bring it back by snuffing out our native language. We should never ever allow these charlatans to do that. Okay, always resist this kind of subversion. Okay, and it's mostly the Greens you'll find who are doing this. So just stop that in its tracks before it gains any momentum. Um, yeah, I mean the rest of this article you can go through in your own time. There's similar points about you know Quebec in France, sorry, Quebec in Canada, and how English has become more and more dominant there, unfortunately, even in Quebec itself. And, that's a shame, obviously, because, French is like, it is the main language of Quebec, and it's supposed to be a bilingual country with French and English having equal footing, but increasingly as time goes on, English is gaining more and more traction. French is becoming less important, and even in Quebec itself, it's starting to get dominated by English, because English is at a global level. Even though French is a big language at a global level as well, English is even bigger. English is definitely one of the big global languages, and French is a big hitter too, but it's not in the same league as English, and as a result, English is going to win in that battle, and that's what's really starting to happen in Canada, even in Quebec itself, which was much more French speaking, but is less so as time goes on. And another part of that again is the foreign influence, the influx of foreigners into Canada. Canada has got ridiculous levels of immigration. I mean, you think it's bad in Ireland, and times it has been bad over the last 20, 25 years, and still continues to be an issue. But Canada just takes the biscuit. Canada has ridiculous levels of immigration on an annual basis. And the result has been that it's more likely that people coming into Canada and into Quebec, it's more likely they will speak English than French. Therefore, for the local people, in order to communicate with the foreigners, they're more likely going to have to switch into English rather than French. And that again has the same effect of starting to gradually dilute the French influence in Quebec and in the rest of Canada, and continues to assert the dominance of English, So again, it's kind of politeness thing as well, and at an institutional level too, and educational level, the system will sort of adapt itself to the most culturally dominant language, which is English, and the one which foreigners are most likely to speak, which is going to be English too. And the result being that French becomes less and less prominent, less and less prevalent as a national level, and even in Quebec itself. Okay, I think we're almost done at this point. I mean, the rest of it you can go through in your own time, but it is a fascinating article. And hopefully I've made some interesting points for you there along the way. I would encourage you to have a good read through that article. It's so interesting, and it makes so many relevant points along the way. But like I said, what initially triggered my memory regarding this article was the intolerance, the intransigence of these hardcore LGBTQ activists outside the church in Ballyfermot, and they're a perfect example of how all it takes is an intolerant, intransigent minority, in order to affect change and outsize influence on a tolerant majority.